So lobbyists in 2015 took in north of $3 billion. And those are just the official numbers. The top 14 law firms, the best performing 14 law firms took in nearly $140 million. So there are many, many lobbyists in Washington, but the open secret is that very few of them are any good. In a moment, you're going to meet one of the very best, Darrell Connor, who runs the lobbying shop at K&L Gates. So how do we know he's that good? Well, interviewing him will be Tony Costello, my former colleague at Bloomberg Government, who's developed a really innovative approach to measuring performance of lobbyists that's data-driven and not a popularity contest. So please help me welcome Tony and Darrell.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Eric hit on it a bit, but what we're trying to do at Bloomberg is bring a new approach to the advocacy industry. And that approach, the characteristics of that we're bringing are things like being data-driven, systematic, business principled in both providers as well as companies' objectives to achieve their public policy goals. And we think that that's sort of a unique offering because if you think about historically the advocacy industry, it's been a pretty squishy type of market, right? So you think about things that are valued there in terms of the strength of one's Rolodex or anecdotal events that folks experience. And that's really what's driven a lot of the business activity in that industry historically. But we think that Washington is changing and that historical approach in isolation won't endure. And so that's a lot of the work that we're trying to bring to this market. Now, today I'm lucky enough to have one of our key partners, Darrell Connor, who runs the public policy team at K&L Gates. And Darrell has been, and his team have been both a fantastic performing firm, but also an early adapter of some of this new approach and new tools that we're trying to bring to the market. So we're very lucky to have him here with us today. I'd love to start off by having Darrell talk. You talk a little bit about where the advocacy market has been in, call it the last 3 to 5 years, both in terms of how much risk and opportunity exists for companies based on how much Washington policy activity is occurring, as well as if companies are appropriately engaging in those types of risks and opportunities.
Well, Tony, thank you, and thank you, everyone. I think while it's true that electoral change, we've had 6 change elections in the last 6 years, and partisanship is at an all-time high. The regulatory activities are perceived, and Washington is perceived very differently today than it was probably even 10, maybe even 20 years ago. And so, having been in the business for about 20 years, I've seen a lot of change in public policy. But there's a common misperception today, in particular, that nothing is really happening in Washington. That may be a good thing for a lot of the businesses. But the reality is there's a lot happening, and including in the advocacy marketplace. Government intervention, as our global managing partner puts it, is ratchet-like, and it's in one direction. We're not seeing any relaxation in government intervention. We're seeing a lot more of it. If you just look at over the last 2 years, you've seen about 3,500 regulations and rules come out of government agencies in 2014. In 2015, you saw about 2,600 of them. You saw about 290 some laws passed in Congress in the 113th Congress, and you saw about 134 so far this year. So Congress is doing a lot. The administration is doing a lot. And that doesn't include all of the policy letters that people put out at agencies or the letter rulings that people get that give you advice on a private matter. So there's a lot going on. And in the advocacy space, I think what we have seen, quite frankly, is that because of that perception that there's nothing happening in Washington, that we've seen a pullback in some areas in Washington among business. And quite frankly, all of these rules, regulations, legislation, pick winners and losers in that process. Business wins, business loses, and we've seen that the ones that have done better, and your analysis certainly supports this, the ones that have done better in the marketplace in DC are the ones that have been actively engaged and consistently engaged. It's very difficult to come into Washington and say, I have a problem, can you help me solve it in 3 months? Washington doesn't really work that way. You have an issue, you have to educate people, you have to work through the process, and that takes time. And so we have a situation where the trends are pretty significant for business in terms of what's happening in Washington, and the opportunities are there as well for business. So I think when you look at the lobbying business, and certainly in the case of a law firm, there are opportunities to help and provide real value for companies.
Yeah, I want to share some analysis that I think really backs up some of the points that you made. And it does it from a little bit of a different perspective. You mentioned sort of the type of activity that's happening in Washington and measured it in terms of number of bills and number of regulations that have occurred. We did a study of companies' 10K analyses, and specifically the risk factors section. So we looked at 60 companies across a diverse section of industries as well as those of differing sizes. And we looked at different types of risk factors that were mentioned, right? So a lot of people talk about macro risks or reliance on key management, et cetera. And inevitably, the one risk that shows up everywhere is government-related risk. And so we measured those different risk factors over time. And what we found was that there was a 50% growth in these companies' 10Ks talking about government-related risk. But translate that to the right-hand side of the slide, where you're observing this sort of disconnect, where the amount of resources that's being put into addressing those increasing risks and opportunities is not corresponding to the types of risks that are being perceived by companies around activity that's happening in Washington. So that's a little bit of some history, some recent history around the advocacy market. But tell us about what you see in the future, and specifically around probably what's one of the most fascinating election cycles that we've ever seen.
So Tony's asking me to predict who's going to win, and I'm not going to take the bait. I think that this has been one of the most fascinating election cycles that I've ever seen. Obviously, we have 2 candidates now that are going head-to-head. And I think it's a situation where, quite frankly, there's going to be a change. We've had the same president for 8 years. We will have a new president. It may be of the same party. It may be of a different party. There's also a question of what it means for the down ballot. I mean, are we going to see a change in the Senate? Are we going to see a change in the House, which is actually being talked about now? I think that if you look at the current electoral situation, if it's a Democrat, I think you will see a little more consistency in terms of the administration and the way they approach things. Obviously, environmental issues will probably stay at the top of the heap of things to pay attention to. I think as you look at tax policy, their position, the Clinton administration's position would probably be more closely aligned to where the Obama administration has been. But if you look at trade, I think it's clear that the trade issue, Clinton has a different perspective than the Obama administration. Take the Trump side of the coin. I have no idea, I'll be honest. But it's going to change, and you can bet that his priorities are going to be very different than whatever the current administration is. His tax policy will be very different, quite frankly, than whatever a Democratic administration will be. His environmental policy will likely be different than what the current administration will be. And so I think that change creates a lot of uncertainty. It creates a lot of opportunity. It creates a lot of risk. And again, as I said, there's a misperception that nothing happens in D.C. I mean, if you just look at last year, they did a major Social Security reform, the first long-term transportation and infrastructure bill in a decade. They lifted a 40-year ban on oil exports. They passed an education reform bill. All of these were very large things. And now some of them were done in the context of other legislative packages. Lifting the oil export ban was done on an appropriations bill. But those things are going to happen over and over and over again. You know, just because there's a change in the administration or a change in Congress doesn't mean nothing's going to happen.
Right.
You know, something will happen. And I think, you know, your slide here is a very interesting slide. I think as you look at companies making investments in Washington, D.C., tend to do better in terms of their rate of return on investment. We internally are much more sophisticated than we've ever been, and I wouldn't say that's terribly sophisticated, but much better in terms of measuring return on investment, value to clients, in terms of the way we approach our lobbying activities. We ask clients, okay, what's it cost if a regulation gets imposed? We try to value that versus what's the investment to either deflect a rule, change a piece of legislation, and try to work with clients so that we demonstrate that value to them as part of that process. So I think the upcoming election is going to be very interesting, but either way, it's going to change the dynamic in Washington, D.C., and business will be affected.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned some practices that you thought that not only you, but that corporations should be adhering to, and you talked a little bit about the return on investment. And here, what we've done here was a study of a preferential tax treatment for film and television companies, and what we wanted to do was measure what the return on investment of $1 was in terms of spending on lobbying to get that preferential tax treatment, and compare it to some other capital allocation options if these companies had invested $1. And what you see here, I think there's two real key points around this slide. Number one is just going through the exercise of computing a return on investment is a huge leap forward in the advocacy market, right? If you think about how this links back to the previous slide, I think one of those major disconnects is that folks in the market are still a little bit too squishy about how things are measured. Well, it was about how many co-sponsors we got, or whether or not our fly-in went well or not. And you can indeed quantify a lot of these things. And so just simply going through the exercise of trying to quantify the type of behavior that's occurring and whether or not it's generating shareholder returns is important. The second thing that's important is if you look at the economics that effective advocacy work can drive, by nature, it simply dwarfs any other capital investment allocation decision that can be made. I mean, we're talking about 44 times on your dollar versus buying back your stock, which is a nice return on your investment, or knowing that Netflix was going to be the best performing stock in the S&P 500 and investing in that. But still, the economics of investing, of effective advocacy simply dwarf other types of capital allocation decisions. And so are there any other things that, you know, in addition to being prepared for the sea change that's going to occur with whoever's the next president and the next Senate, the companies should be thinking about to take advantage and engage?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you look at this return, I mean, obviously, you know, not everyone's going to get that kind of return, and there are some free riders in these, right? I mean, that derive the economic benefit from not having to make any investment in it at all. I think the interesting part about this is I analogize it to what happened in marketing. So marketing was this amorphous thing that no one could measure for a very long time, and you know, you'd put marketing dollars in, and you'd always ask people, okay, what was the return on investment? How many, did it increase sales by X amount? And actually, the advocacy business is much along the same way. It's not measured the same way as traditional business units would kind of go out and say, okay, you're investing X number of dollars in advocacy. What are we getting out of it? How are we measuring that? Not do we know this congressman or do we have a relationship with this regulator, but how are we measuring that return? And I think this is going to be a very interesting dynamic going forward for companies that really are sophisticated and take the time to sit down and figure out, because I don't think it's very hard to sit down and say, if this Affordable Care Act rule is implemented and I have to impose this amount of cost on my businesses, what is the probability of success of changing it? What is it going to cost me? And then what do I need to do to affect that change? And I think it's that last part that is even going to become more sophisticated as part of this process goes on. And people look at and evaluate the tools that they have in Washington, D.C., the human resources that they're investing in to advocate on their behalf, whether in-house or external counsel. I think they're going to look to drive the types of returns on investment that you're looking at here. I think as you look at this current election, you know a storm is coming, okay? Again, it's either going to be a Clinton or Trump administration, and I think it's very wise for companies to really sit down and ask themselves, okay, what do we see as our top 3 business risks if Trump wins, if Clinton wins, okay? How do you quantify the magnitude of that risk? What have you done to put together the list of things that you can do to either deflect the risk, manage the risk, defeat the risk? Those kinds of questions companies do every day. And I think you could do the exact same thing with respect to your public advocacy, whether it's in Washington, D.C., at a local level, at a state level, and really figure out those kinds of answers. And I think it will help prioritize where people can actually get their return, the best return on the invested dollar in advocacy.
Yeah, and as I said, you guys have been on the forefront of this really data-driven, systematic approach. As we wrap up here with our time, are there, and we think now moving from the companies that you're serving to firms like yours, the service provider, are there any key tidbits, best practices that you would recommend to running an effective advocacy shop, and in particular one that's tied to a significant law firm?
Well, I think law firms are uniquely positioned in this space. I mean, if you look at most of our clients come to us with a problem. It's not we want you to go advocate for X. It's we have this problem, help us solve the problem. And I think traditional law firms look at it either in a regulatory or a judicial perspective. I think a law firm like ours adds additional piece to it, which is the legislative branch. Great story about when the firm first started 43 years ago, there was an associate who wrote a memo and described all of the things you could do. You could file a suit, you could litigate in a particular way, you could go to the regulator, and the head of the office at the time said, well, you missed one critical thing. And he was like, what did I miss? He said, well, you didn't say anything about changing the law. And so we view things as a 3-dimensional chessboard, and if you can move the pieces around on the chessboard, what we call the policy life cycle. If you're involved in the legislative aspects of it, and you move to a regulatory environment, if you were involved there, you really understand it. And then if there's a dispute, whether it's with a regulator or somewhere along the way, you're in the best position because you understand the full life cycle of the issues. And so that's why we feel in a law firm we're extremely well positioned to help clients.
Darrell, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all of your time and attention.
Thank you, Tony.